It was a humid summer evening when I found myself driving through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania. The sun had long since set, and the darkness wrapped around my car like a thick blanket. My destination was still hours away, and the drowsiness that crept over me was becoming impossible to ignore. My eyelids felt heavy, and I knew I couldn't safely continue the journey without some rest. I hadn't seen any signs of civilization for miles, but just as I was about to pull over on the side of the road to take a nap, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. "Dewdrop Motel," it read, the letters barely hanging on to their faint glow. The place looked run down, the paint peeling from the walls and the parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. But I wasn't in a position to be picky. All I needed was a bed to crash on for a few hours before I could continue my trip. I pulled into the empty parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, and parked close to the front office. As I stepped out of the car, the night air felt heavy with moisture, making me uncomfortable. The only sound was the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees surrounding the property. The building looked as if it had been forgotten by time, its wooden exterior weathered and gray, windows dimly lit by the glow of old-fashioned lamps inside. I entered the office, which was small and cluttered with old magazines and faded brochures. An old man sat behind the counter, hunched over a newspaper. He didn't even look up when I walked in. The room was stiflingly hot, and the only source of cooling was an ancient tabletop fan that buzzed loudly, doing little to cut through the oppressive heat. "Excuse me, do you have any rooms available?" I asked, my voice cutting through the stillness. The man finally looked up from his paper, his eyes tired and dull. Without any greeting or pleasantries, he simply muttered, "65. I handed him my credit card, and after what felt like an eternity of him fumbling with an old credit card machine, he handed me a tarnished metal key attached to a blank key ring. "Room 8, he said, his tone void of any emotion. "Could I get a corner room?" I inquired, hoping for a bit more privacy. "No," he replied bluntly, already turning his attention back to the newspaper, the conversation clearly over. I took the key and walked back to my car, my footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. Room 8 was on the ground floor of the building, furthest from the office. The door was heavy and the key stubborn, requiring several attempts to unlock it. I had to jiggle it forcefully, and when it finally gave, the door creaked open with a long, unsettling groan. The room smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The scent of stale cigarette smoke mixed with something sour, a smell I couldn't quite place. The carpet was a dull, matted blue, stained in several places. There was an old couch against one wall, its fabric worn and threadbare, a small coffee table, and a bed that looked as if it had seen better days decades ago. I shut the door behind me and tried to lock it, but the lock was just as stubborn as before. After a minute of struggling, I finally got it to latch, though it didn't feel secure. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed, the springs creaking loudly in protest. I grabbed the remote to turn on the TV, hoping for some background noise, but the remote didn't work. I sighed and tossed it aside, deciding to skip the TV and just try to sleep. As I lay there, the room felt oppressive, the air heavy and thick. I was just beginning to drift off when a loud thump at the window jolted me awake. My heart raced as I sat up, staring at the window, trying to make out what had caused the noise. I could see a shadowy figure standing just outside, the faint outline of a man. He knocked again, more insistently this time, and I could hear his voice, muffled but urgent. "Please, I need help. I'm hurt. Let me in." His voice was low, almost pleading, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I stayed frozen on the bed, my mind racing. The man outside knocked again, harder this time. "Please, I'm begging you. Let me in." Fear gripped me as I realized that this could be a trap. I didn't respond, didn't move, just stayed as still as possible. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I waited, listening, my ears straining to hear any movement outside. Slowly I got up and crept to the window, peeking out from the side. The man was gone, but the fear lingered, a knot in my stomach. I checked the door to make sure it was still locked. Giving it a few hard tugs, it held but barely. The flimsy lock was all that stood between me and whoever had been outside. I closed the curtains tightly, shutting out the night and whatever else might be lurking in it. My nerves were frayed, but eventually the exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. I don't know how long I slept before I was woken up by a strange clicking sound. It started softly, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. In my half-asleep state, I thought it was part of a dream, some distant noise creeping into my subconscious. But as I slowly woke up, the sound persisted, pulling me fully awake. I realized that the room had grown cold, a sharp contrast to the earlier, stifling heat. I reached down to pull the blanket over me, but it wasn't there. Confused, I sat up and saw the blanket at the foot of the bed, crumpled as if someone had pulled it off of me. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could even process what was happening, I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing at the foot of the bed, looming over me. The scream that formed in my throat never came out. The figure leaned closer, and I could see a glint of something in the dim light. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice low and menacing. "I won't hurt you if you stay quiet." I couldn't see his face, just the outline of a man shrouded in darkness. My body was paralyzed with fear, every muscle tense, every nerve screaming to run, but I couldn't move. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with tension. "Where's your wallet?" he asked, his voice still a whisper, but with an edge of impatience. "In my jeans," I stammered, barely able to get the words out. "On the floor." He moved away from the bed, crouching down to where my jeans lay in a heap. I could hear him rifling through the pockets, the sound of fabric rustling in the quiet room. He found the wallet and stood back up. "What else you got?" he asked, his tone demanding. "Nothing," I replied, my voice shaking. "I'm just on a road trip. I don't have anything else." There was a long pause, and I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to the door. He fiddled with the lock, the same one I had struggled with earlier, and then he was gone, the door creaking shut behind him. For a moment, I was too stunned to move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I finally found the strength to move, I leapt out of bed and ran to the door, fumbling with the lock again to secure it. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me several tries to get it to latch. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands trembling as I dialed the number. They said they would send someone out, but in the meantime, there was nothing they could do. I didn't feel any safer, knowing that the man who had just been in my room was out there somewhere. When the police finally arrived, they brought me back to the front office to review the security footage. The old man behind the counter was still there, his expression unreadable as he pulled up the footage. The grainy video showed the figure entering my room, but he was wearing a mask and a hat, hiding his face from the camera. There were no distinguishing features, nothing that could help identify him. The police took my statement, but there wasn't much else they could do. They advised me to leave, which I was more than eager to do. The old man at the counter refunded my money without a word, his eyes never meeting mine. I packed up my things and left the room, the door creaking one last time as I shut it behind me. As I drove away, the motel shrinking in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to figure out what I could have done differently, but nothing made sense. I was just grateful to be leaving that place behind. But the nightmare didn't end there. The following night, I stopped at another motel, this one a little nicer and in a more populated area. I was still on edge, but I needed rest. The place was quiet, the room clean and well lit, a stark contrast to the Dewdrop Motel. I took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away the lingering fear from the night before. As I stood under the stream of water, I felt the tension slowly begin to ease. But as I stepped out of the shower, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There on the bathroom mirror was a message written in the steam, "I'm not done with you." The words were scrawled across the glass, dripping slightly as the steam evaporated. My heart pounded in my chest and I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me. But the bathroom was empty. The door was still locked, the room undisturbed. Panic set in as I grabbed my phone and dialed the police again. But just as I did, the power in the room went out. The phone call failed, and I was plunged into darkness. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I stumbled through the room searching for the door, but the darkness was suffocating and I couldn't find my bearings. Then I heard it again, the clicking sound, just like the night before. It started softly, but it grew louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from inside the room. I reached out blindly, trying to find the door, the walls, anything that would give me a sense of direction. The clicking grew louder, closer, until it was right next to me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, as I felt a presence in the room with me. The air grew colder, and I could feel something moving, brushing against me in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the power came back on. The lights flickered to life, revealing an empty room. I was alone, the only sound my ragged breathing. I turned slowly, expecting to see someone, something, but there was nothing. The room was exactly as it had been before. But when I looked at the mirror again, the words were gone, wiped clean as if they had never been there. My phone buzzed in my hand, the police dispatcher on the other end asking if I was okay, but I couldn't find the words to explain what had just happened. I didn't stay the night. I packed up my things, leaving the motel without even checking out. I drove through the night, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed. Every shadow, every movement on the road made my heart race. By the time I reached my destination, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. But the fear still lingered, a constant, gnawing presence in the back of my mind. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but feel that I'm not alone, that something is still out there, watching, waiting. I've tried to move on, to forget what happened at the Dewdrop Motel, but the memories refuse to fade. Every time I close my eyes, I see the dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, hear the clicking sound in the darkness, and see the message written in the steam. I've checked into countless motels since then, always choosing the busiest, the most well-lit, but the fear never leaves me. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, or if the nightmare will ever truly end. All I know is that I'll never forget the Dewdrop Motel, and the terror that still haunts me to this day. It was late, and I was exhausted. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with sleep. The endless road stretched out before me, the darkened landscape occasionally interrupted by a flickering streetlight or the distant glow of a town. When I saw the sign for a motel up ahead, I decided to pull over for the night. It was one of those places that seemed to appear out of nowhere, a small, run-down building with a dimly lit neon sign that read, Motel of Echoes. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of old cars parked near the entrance. The building itself looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and windows that were covered in grime. But I didn't care. All I wanted was a bed to collapse into. I grabbed my bag and headed to the front office. The lobby was eerily quiet when I stepped inside. An old TV in the corner played static, casting an eerie glow across the room. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a sallow face, looked up as I approached the desk. His eyes were dull, and he barely acknowledged me as I asked for a room. After a few moments of silence, he handed me a key with the number 12 etched onto it. "Rooms around the back," he said in a flat tone, not bothering to offer any more information. I nodded and made my way outside. The air was thick with humidity as I walked down the cracked concrete path to my room. The motel was shaped like a horseshoe, with the rooms arranged in a semicircle around a central courtyard that was overgrown with weeds. The only sound was the buzzing of a nearby street lamp. I found room 12 at the far end of the building. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a musty smell hit me as I stepped inside. The room was small and shabby, with outdated furniture and a bed that looked like it had been there for decades. I tossed my bag on the bed and went to close the curtains, which were thin and yellowed with age. As I drew the curtains shut, I noticed something odd. The window didn't look out onto the parking lot like I had expected. Instead, it faced another window just a few feet away, separated by a narrow alley. The other window was dark, and I couldn't see inside, but I could tell there was a room on the other side. I shook off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine and decided to take a quick shower before bed. The bathroom was just as dingy as the rest of the room, with cracked tiles and a leaky faucet. I turned on the shower and waited for the water to warm up, but it never did. Frustrated, I settled for a quick, cold rinse before stepping out and drying off with a thin, rough towel. As I was getting dressed, I heard a faint sound coming from the other side of the wall. It was muffled, but it sounded like someone talking. I paused, listening intently. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I figured it was just another guest in the next room, maybe on the phone, and thought nothing more of it. I climbed into bed, the springs creaking loudly as I shifted to get comfortable. The mattress was lumpy and the sheets were scratchy, but I was too tired to care. I reached over to turn off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. That's when I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it was louder, and it seemed to be coming from right outside my door. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. The whispering continued, low and steady, like someone was standing just on the other side of the door, talking to themselves. I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against it. The whispering grew clearer, but I still couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a conversation, but with only one person speaking. I stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. After a few tense moments, I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole. What I saw sent a jolt of terror through me. There was a man standing in the hallway facing my door. He was tall and thin, with his head slightly bowed. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see his lips moving as if he was still whispering, though no sound was coming out. His hand was raised just inches away from the door, as if he was about to knock. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, whether to confront him or stay quiet and hope he would go away. My mind raced as I tried to figure out who he was and what he wanted. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked away. I listened as his footsteps faded down the hallway, and the whispering started again, growing fainter until it was gone completely. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on and stayed in bed, clutching the covers tightly around me, my eyes glued to the door. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept expecting the man to come back. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left as quickly as I could. The front desk clerk didn't even look up as I dropped off the key. I drove away from the motel, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he was whispering outside my door, but I've never stayed in a motel again, and I never will. It was supposed to be a quick overnight stay on my way to visit family. The drive was too long to make in one day, so I had planned to stop at a motel about halfway through the trip. I found a place just off the highway, a small, unassuming building with a sign that simply read, Motel. It looked old, but not in a rundown way. More like it had been there forever, forgotten by time. The lobby was empty when I walked in, save for a young woman behind the counter. She greeted me with a smile, though something about it seemed forced, like she wasn't really happy to see me. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my own exhaustion. After all, it was late, and I just wanted to get to my room and sleep. She handed me a key and told me my room was at the end of the hall on the second floor. As I made my way up the creaky stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hallway was dimly lit, with old wallpaper peeling at the edges and a musty smell hanging in the air. It reminded me of the kind of place that might have been nice once, but had long since fallen into disrepair. I found my room at the very end of the hall, the number 203 barely visible on the door. The key turned with some difficulty, the lock sticking as if it hadn't been used in a long time. When I finally managed to get the door open, I stepped inside and flicked on the light. The room was small and basic, with a bed, a dresser, and a small TV on a stand in the corner. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, and the carpet was worn thin in places. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. I tossed my bag on the bed and went to check out the bathroom. The bathroom was tiny, with cracked tiles and a mirror that had started to cloud over with age. As I washed my hands, I noticed that the water was ice cold, no matter how long I let it run. I made a mental note to mention it to the front desk in the morning and decided to just brush my teeth and get to bed. As I was settling in, I noticed something strange. The door to the room didn't have a peephole. It was just a solid door with no way to see who was outside. I found that odd, but I didn't dwell on it. I was too tired to care. I clambered into bed, pulling the thin blanket up around me. The mattress was lumpy and uncomfortable, but I was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. It was a soft, rhythmic knock, almost polite. I groggily sat up, trying to shake off the sleep, and glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was just after 2 a.m. The knocking continued, gentle but insistent. I got out of bed, my heart starting to pound in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the idea of someone knocking on my door in the middle of the night was unsettling. I approached the door cautiously, calling out, "Who is it?" There was no answer, just the continued knocking. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Without a peephole, I had no way of seeing who was on the other side. The knocking stopped for a moment, then started again, a little louder this time. I decided to ignore it. Whoever it was, they would have to leave eventually. I backed away from the door, but as soon as I did, the knocking became more urgent, the sound echoing through the silent room. Fear gripped me, and I backed up against the wall, staring at the door. The knocking was relentless now, louder and faster, as if someone was pounding on the door with their fists. I was about to shout for them to go away when the knocking suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt it was jarring. I stood there holding my breath, waiting for something to happen, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just eerie, suffocating silence. I don't know how long I stood there, pressed against the wall, staring at the door. It felt like an eternity. My heart was racing, my mind running through all the possible explanations. Maybe it was just a mistake, someone knocking on the wrong door, or maybe it was a prank. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Finally, I gathered enough courage to move. I inched toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly turned the knob and cracked the door open, just enough to peer out into the hallway. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, stretching out in both directions, illuminated by the dim, flickering lights. I opened the door a bit wider, leaning out to get a better look. Nothing. The silence was thick, oppressive, and I could feel the cold air seeping into the room. I quickly shut the door and locked it, my heart still pounding. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself down, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to go back to bed, though the idea of sleeping now seemed impossible. I lay there staring up at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old building, my mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again, the knocking. This time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from inside the room. I bolted upright, my eyes scanning the darkness, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was a soft, rhythmic knocking, like someone tapping on wood. It was coming from the direction of the closet. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the closet door. It was closed, just as I had left it when I first arrived. But now there was a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from within. I didn't want to go near it, but I knew I had to. I had to know what was making that noise. I slipped out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor, and slowly approached the closet. The knocking continued, steady and unrelenting, as if something inside was trying to get out. I reached for the closet door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then yanked the door open. There was nothing there. The closet was empty, just a small space with a few old hangers clattering together on a metal rod. The knocking had stopped the moment I opened the door, leaving only the eerie silence in its wake. I backed away, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to think, what to believe. I closed the closet door and stumbled back to the bed, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. too terrified to close my eyes, afraid of what might happen if I did. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the window, I grabbed my things and left the room. I didn't even bother checking out at the front desk. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. When I finally reached my destination later that day, I tried to put the whole experience behind me, but something kept nagging at me, a feeling that I couldn't shake. So I did some research, hoping to find some explanation, something that would make sense of what I had experienced. What I found sent chills down my spine. The motel I had stayed at had a dark history, one that had been largely forgotten. Years ago, there had been a series of mysterious disappearances, all centered around that very same room, room 203. Guests who stayed there would vanish without a trace, their belongings left behind, but no sign of where they had gone. The room had been closed off for years, but for some reason it had been reopened recently, though no one seemed to know why. I realized then that I had been lucky. I had heard the knocking, but I hadn't opened the door. I hadn't let whatever it was inside that room take me. But I knew I would never forget that night, the night I stayed in the vanishing room, and I would never stay in another motel again. Join us next time as we delve into more tales of terror and suspense, exploring the darkest corners of the human psyche and the supernatural forces that seek to exploit our deepest fears. Until then, remember to keep the lights on and never venture into the shadows alone.